Okay, Rashid, first of all, welcome to the Center for Middle East Studies. I want to sort of shift the conversation from the discussions and debates you've been having since you arrived here and focus on a topic of which you are, in many ways, the leading global expert on. And that's the question of Palestinian nationalism, in particular, Palestinian leadership.
Right.
And one of the, I think, tragedies of the Palestinian national movement and the Palestinian people's struggle for national self-determination, in my view, has been the colossal failure of an effective leadership to represent them, to push forward their democratic and national agenda. And so, there's a question here that needs to be answered. And of course, it can't be done in a few minutes, but I want to just pick your brain a bit and ask you the first question. What went wrong? Okay. How did a movement, how did a cause that was very popular throughout the Arab Islamic world, with the Third World, end up where we are today?
Right.
And how would you sort of explain, just in broad terms, how this leadership ended up really, failing in such a colossal manner?
Right. Well, I actually wrote a book called The Iron Cage, in which I tried to set out my understanding of this problem in a very long perspective, going back to the beginning of the 20th century and focusing especially on the 20s, 30s, and 40s, and trying to explain why there were leadership failures in that era. And then showing how the next generation of leadership, which emerged in the 40s and 50s, and was responsible for the renaissance of the Palestinian national movement from the 60s onwards, differed from the previous leadership in class and in educational and in aspirational terms. And I tried to be fair to them because they were extraordinarily successful in both reunifying Palestinian ranks, creating a relatively unified national movement, appealing to Palestinian, Arab, Muslim, and world audiences from the 60s through the 80s. But this is where the problems emerge. Firstly, this leadership was subject to a relentless campaign of assassinations. And I have to say that most of the best of that generation, who by now actually are quite long in the tooth in any case, but most of the best of that generation were eliminated systematically one by one, most of them by Israeli efforts, but some of them by the efforts of Arab governments. I mean, a large number of them were killed by groups that were manipulated by either Syrian or Libyan or Iraqi intelligence services. And I think that at a certain point, they lost touch with their mass base, especially after the departure from Beirut of the PLO leadership. They were in Tunis and in Yemen, in places very far away from concentrations of Palestinian population. They were dependent on a diplomatic strategy that was in many ways faulty. They had more or less given up the idea of putting pressure on Israel through armed struggle, which had not succeeded very well in any case. And brilliant analysts like Korbel Ahmed had told the PLO leadership that this was not going to work, and they had not been willing to listen. But in any case, it had more or less ceased to be a major element of their strategy. And when the first Intifada came along, it was a manna from heaven for them. The first Intifada was the first significant Palestinian strategic victory, I would argue, in the whole course of Palestinian struggle. Right. You could say that to some extent that the successes of the PLO in establishing a new representative of the Palestinians was another important success in the 60s and 70s. But perhaps even more important than that was that the Intifada showed the world what occupation was like, showed the Israelis that the status quo could not continue. But unfortunately, that victory was frittered away in the negotiations of the 90s and the early 2000s. And that's where I think this leadership has really failed.
To what extent really here is the problem is the individual character of Arafat and his closest advisors? I mean, to what extent can we sort of, focus on the failure of leadership, on the individual of Arafat himself and the decisions that he made that has led us to where we are today?
I would make an argument that this is a broader problem than just the Mufti in the 30s, or just Arafat in the 80s, or any individual. I think that you have a style of leadership in much of the Arab world, the Za'im, the single leader style. Arafat was part of a much more collegial leadership than a lot of these countries have had. But he was first among equals. And that style is one problem. A second problem is being distant from the people and not having to defend yourself in front of a representative assembly. And over time, the PLO became less and less representative,
right.
less and less of a live, functioning, organically sound body. And it's a shell now. So I think Arafat, personally, you can describe a lot of these problems as functions of his personality. Mm-hmm. But I think an overstress on the individual personality of this or that leader is probably a mistake. I fault him a great deal in that book, The Iron Cage. Right. Him personally. I fault the Mufti a great deal personally. But I think these are broader structural issues. And I think that being in a situation where you're cut off, in particular, from that majority of Palestinians who live outside of Palestine, was a devastating blow from 82 onwards.
But this is not unique to the Palestinian national movement. The ANC were cut off from their own society, but they were able to organize a very effective. True. So how does one explain the difference?
And Kurdish national movements.
Have
been, in some cases, cut off.
And East Timorese, there's many others.
Right.
I think there's a deeper sort of set of problems here.
Right, I think you're probably right. You're probably right.
Well, let me push you a bit on that. I had an interview with the late Israel Shahak on this before he passed away, and he said one of the problems that resulted in the corruption and failure of the PLO was that there was just too much money that they had access to that bred corruption, and it was a byproduct of the Arab state system, the Arab League, buying off people, and that led to a certain lack of democratic accountability. And if you contrast that with other national liberation movements, they had to be much more efficient. They didn't have those resources. Right. To what extent do you buy into that argument?
Well, that was already a problem in Beirut before 1982. Mm-hmm. And it was a problem partly because Arafat used money and perks and so on and so forth, and patronage as a means of buying loyalty. Mm-hmm. But the PLO in Beirut was in a situation of war. And so those phenomena, even though they were harmful, were not the primary phenomena. I mean, you basically had to provide food, or you basically had to provide fuel, or you basically had to have ammunition, or you basically had to have some kind of security and some kind of governance. And those overwhelmingly imperative tasks in a situation of war. I mean, we're talking about war in Lebanon from 73, really, when the Lebanese army attacks the camps first, until 1982, meant that these phenomena were not as important as they became. But that period of complete idleness in Tunis or Yemen or wherever, from 82 until they returned in the mid-90s, was catastrophic. It destroyed the PLO, in my view. It destroyed it as a functioning organization. The people who came back were hollow shells. And when they arrived in the West Bank and Gaza, they shocked people by their emptiness, by their hollowness, by their lack of any kind of apparent commitment to the cause. They expected now to be received like heroes, to achieve status, and not have to do anything in return. They felt that they had won. Here we are, we're back, we're going to govern you, we deserve this, and so on and so on. So this is worse and deeper than just corruption. When you then add to that the lavish funding that came in terms of taxes that Israel, or customs duties that Israel allowed to the Palestinian Authority, which are Palestinian revenues that should have been for the Palestinians anyway, and European, Arab, Japanese, and American funding that came to the PA, it just became a thoroughly unhealthy situation. Already you had patronage. Already you had corrupt means being employed. But the system simply was incapable of retaining any kind of integrity. And when the system was somewhat rectified in the last decade or so, all that meant was, in a sense, corruption was regularized, corruption was institutionalized, and these kinds of perks. I mean, drive around Ramallah. You think you're in Amman. This is not a liberated country. This is not a nation state. This is not a sovereign entity. This is not the capital of anything. It looks like a vast, booming, it's a green zone with buildings going up and fancy offices and expensive cars and restaurants where people spend fortunes. This is a very unhealthy situation.
Okay, this leads to the next question. Given the failures and the colossal disaster of the past, the question now is, what about the future? think most people would agree, at least most Palestinians, I think, will agree that the current leadership under Abu Mazen and his gang have been equally as bad as the previous leadership under
Worse.
Arafat. Worse, okay.
Oh, worse. I mean, look, the Arafat leadership, in my view, messed up
Right.
systematically. And you can go back, talk about the 70s, or you can talk about the 80s, you certainly can talk about the 90s.
Right.
But they at least had some achievements to
Right.
their credit.
Okay.
I mean, they created the PLO.
Right. So
they,
now
they put the Palestinians on the
we've
map.
gotten worse now.
They got the Palestinians recognized.
Right.
They survived Lebanon. I mean, these are not inconsiderable achievements.
Absolutely.
You're not talking about a struggle where the Palestinians were equal to the Israelis, and yet the PLO managed to survive. So for all their failures,
They
their
have
failures of
success,
strategy and their excesses and so on and so forth after they returned to Palestine, that was a generation which could claim some things to their credit. I think that since the 90s onwards, it's been a catalog of catastrophes and disasters for the Palestinians, which this leadership bears a huge share of the responsibility for, without any, in my view, any countervening benefits that they've provided. The good things that have happened, that the Palestinian Authority has done, have been essentially the work of Palestinians from the occupied territories, creating structures that were already there under occupation and developing them. And it's been civil society rather than the state that's done the best things.
Right. So this leads to the big question, what about the future, and why aren't Palestinian intellectuals like yourself saying, look, enough is enough. We need to chart a different path. We need a 180-degree turn. This current leadership does not represent us. It doesn't represent the West Bank or Gaza. It certainly doesn't represent the Palestinian diaspora. We need a completely new vision for Palestinian nationalism. We will thank the leaders of the past. We're moving in a completely different direction. A new charter, a new assembly, a new vision to model a serious, incredible Palestinian leadership on the model of what the ANC did and what other successful national liberations. Why isn't that happening now? It seems to be crying out for an answer, but I see no movement moving in that direction.
I attend conferences and meetings and so on in Palestine. I was there in September, a month ago. And one of the striking things is the degree to which the tone has changed in these kinds of meetings of the kind of people you're talking about, in terms of an increasingly critical and future-oriented critique of all of these things that we've just been talking about, an attempt to lay out a path towards the future. But I think, I am not personally a believer in the idea that intellectuals lead political movements. Intellectuals sometimes lay down some paths that movements follow. People like Mahmoud Darwish, people like Edward Said played a role, but the person who pushed some of the projects that they were engaged in was actually either Yasser Arafat or Salah Khalaf Abu Iyad. The guy who won the PNC over by his speeches was not Edward or Ibrahim Abu Ghud or Iqbal Ahmed or Mahmoud. These incredibly important intellectuals who were pioneers in all kinds of spheres, including the political. It was bruisers who were able to do politics in a way that no intellectual I've ever met has been able to do, who pushed things through. And that is what is lacking, in my view, in Palestine. I know literally scores of Palestinian intellectuals, literally scores, some in the diaspora, some in Palestine, some in the Arab countries, the far diaspora, the Arab countries in Palestine, who have the analysis that you and I are talking about, and more, and better. And they know it better than I do. I'm living in New York, for heaven's sakes. But what we really lack are a political leadership that's able to translate that into actual new tactics. The Palestinians lack several things. They have to have a reunified national movement. They have to have a consensus on how they want to approach the situation. How are we going to deal with this status quo? How do we change it? Do we focus on occupation? Do we focus on integration within Israel? How do we deal with an international consensus which accepts the absolute legitimacy of an Israeli state, which, as defined in the 1947 partition resolution, is a Jewish state, not the Jewish state that Netanyahu is talking about, but nevertheless, that's the language. How do you transcend that? I mean, there's so many questions that are not just intellectual questions. They're questions that have to be turned into something that ordinary people can understand and mobilize around. And I'm really sorry. I know a lot of intellectuals. I know very few of them who are able to mobilize people around. They can put forward the ideas,
Yeah.
but that has to be
Well,
part
that's
of
what
it.
I'm asking. The ideas aren't even out there on the table.
Oh yes, they are.
Claiming or
I
putting
mean,
together
the conference I
documents-
was at, the conference I was
So they're
at
there, they're circulating.
in Ramallah
Yeah.
in September
These conversations were taking
was 20 years after Oslo.
Right.
And many of these ideas I'm talking about are not my ideas. They're things that other people were saying
Yeah.
in the course of 2 days.
So what has to happen in order to materialize them, concretize them, make them move in
I
the
think
direction?
I think circumstances have to change,
Yeah.
and they may change. You know, nobody expected the 1936 revolt to start
Right.
when it did. This was an event that the leadership and intellectuals were completely surprised by. Now, people who had watched Sheikh Izzeddin Qassem's funeral,
Right.
like various intellectual observers in 1935, said, "Oh my God, there's a popular movement brewing here that's going to lead to something." And it did. It erupted in 1936. And it was led partly by intellectuals, partly by political activists, mainly young people, in rebellion against the then political leadership. The same thing happened with the Fatah's launching and the PFLP's similar moves in the mid-60s. These were people, few of whom were intellectuals or school teachers or whatever, but others of whom were just political activists and who launched this. Nobody was expecting it. And I would say the same thing about the first Intifada. And so I'm not saying that it doesn't need necessarily an uprising, but you have to have a start which has to come from the political situation, from people, not from intellectuals. I think for those ideas then to fertilize a movement. That's what happened in the first
But don't
Intifada,
you need
by
to
the way.
have, as a sort of a precondition, a clear statement by someone that, look, this peace process is not of our interest.
Where was the clear statement in 36? The strike started,
Yeah.
and they issued an appeal. It was in the wake of a strike, which sort of was spontaneous.
Yeah, but there's no peace process then. Now everyone's
understand
waiting to
that.
see what happens
I
in these
understand that.
negotiations.
No.
We all know they're not going to lead anywhere
No,
positive for
people
anyone.
are not waiting for that.
Okay.
I mean, some people are,
Yeah.
but the kind of people we're talking about are not waiting.
Right.
I mean, if you look at what's happening in refugee camps today, there in the West Bank, there is clear dissatisfaction brewing with the PA. Now, the Palestinian Authority, has unlimited capacities to subvert, to co-opt, to buy, to use patronage to neutralize, especially stuff in the camps, because the situation is so terrible in Jenin or in Balata or in Dheisha or any of these.
Say nothing about the Lebanese camps.
It's not going to start in the Lebanese
Exactly,
camps.
yeah.
It's going to, the Lebanese, the arrival of refugees from
West Bank.
Syria
Right.
has made the Lebanese camps a catastrophic situation.
Yeah.
The population of these camps is just increased by 100% maybe, or 50% in some cases, by the arrival of probably 100,000 people from Syria who are destitute and who immediately go to their relatives or the people they know or people from the same village in the Palestinian refugee camps in Lebanon. So it's not going to start in Lebanon. It's not going to start in Jordan. Jordan's too well policed. It'll start in the occupied territories, in the camps in the West Bank and maybe Gaza. And there you have a simmering discontent. In the villages, you have simmering discontent. I'm not saying that's going to erupt. Something may happen, something may not happen. The security cooperation between the PA, between Israel, is such that it's going to be very hard for certain kinds of things to happen. On the other hand, you never know. There was the same security cooperation at the time of the Second Intifada. And the Second Intifada turned into, I think it was a catastrophic disaster for the Palestinians, but it was unmanageable, uncontrollable by any leadership for the better part of 2 years. So I think it will be some shock that might lead to the possibility of a change. It may be the failure of this negotiating process. I don't know. I hate to predict. When you're a political scientist, you try and think about how things are changing and where they might go. As a citizen, as a political analyst, as a human being, I like to think about those things, but I don't like to predict. I look back at history. Nobody saw the 1870 commune. Nobody saw that coming. Things just happen. And then we historians with hindsight can go back and analyze why.
Okay, Rashid, thank you very much for your time. I enjoyed the conversation.
Pleasure, Nader.
Thanks. Take care.
Thank you.